Ladies and gentlemen, wow, that was fast. Welcome to Greenwich Library's Signature Series. This series offers dynamic, elevated public programming that engages the Greenwich community and region, featuring nationally recognized experts and conversations that promote an exchange of ideas. This is the second program on the environment, a topic of great importance to all of us. It's made possible through the support of the Greenwich Library Board of Trustees and contributions by generous donors. The library has asked me to remind you too, please keep your mask on, silence your phone and refrain from using it for any photos during the event, and that books will be available for sales and signing after the event, thanks to Diane's books. It's such an honor to be here tonight to introduce two people who are reshaping, God bless you, who are reshaping our relationship with food. And maybe a third. Hi, I'm Mike Geller. Some of you know me from my small business, local business, Mike's Organic. That was really nice. Thanks, guys. A business I started 13 years ago to connect people to small local farms. When I sat with Mark and Kathleen a few weeks ago on the farm at Greenwich, it became clear to me that we shared a mission to support local agriculture and increase access to real food. My story begins right here in Greenwich. I grew up here, fishing, gardening, cooking in backcountry. I was an outdoor cat, I like to say. So I went to school here. I went to Country Day, Greenwich Country. I went to Brunswick. And after that, went off to college and then into the real world and did a lot of really cool things. I ran a hip hop studio in Atlanta. I had an event business. I did the NBA All-Star Game after party at the Playboy Mansion in 2004. 24-year-old me hated it. Media buying, copywriting, advertising, but I never found anything I was passionate about that made me feel fulfilled. So after about 7 years doing that, I quit and I moved to the Kalahari Desert in Africa, where everyone goes, right? And while I was there, I was building a photographic safari camp in the middle of the bush with three Zimbabwean guys, Colin, Langton, and Robert, who I became really good friends with. And I went to this supermarket in Mound, Botswana. And I remember standing in this store, looking around. This is in 2008. And all the food looked better than here. The tomatoes were small and a little bit green. And when you sliced them, there was juice all over the plate. And the eggs weren't refrigerated because when a hen lays an egg, she puts a protective coating on it called the bloom, which stops it from spoiling. If you think about it, if eggs had to be refrigerated in order not to go bad, there'd be no chickens, right? Because she's incubating that egg, it's 100 degrees. So I remember staying there and asking myself, well, why is this food different? And then I went into the bush and had this transformative experience. I was charged by a leopard, almost bitten by a cobra, in a plane that lost an engine. And I fought a 2,000-acre brush fire with a leafy branch, which I'll tell you about next time. And in the process, I really took stock of my life and what was important to me. And it always came back to food. So I came back to the States and I worked at Stone Barns Center for Agriculture, which many of you are probably familiar with, where Blue Hill Restaurant is. And I worked for the head farmer named Jack Algier. And I started learning about our food system, and anything they asked me to do there, I did. Mike, climb that apple tree and prune it. No problem, Jack. Plant those peas. No problem. And it was around the same time that I picked up a book called How to Cook Everything by Mark Bittman. And in tandem, I was learning about our food system and how to cook our food. And it really was the impetus for me to start my business, which is Mike's Organic. And I was one of the first people in America to start a farm to home delivery service where you could get your food directly from a small local farmer. And that led me to meeting hundreds of farmers over the years. It started out with a few out of my parents' house in backcountry Greenwich with a Nissan Pathfinder, doing 9 deliveries a week. And over time, this business has really grown to the point where we're now opening up this flagship retail location in Koskob, which I think is going to be a real community place for the town of Greenwich. We're opening it up where patio.com used to be, the old IHOP, if you remember back that far. I had pancakes with my dad in that building many, many years, 35 years ago, I would say. And the one thing I can tell you that I've learned over my time with small local farmers is that they are unique, they are different, and they are our future. Without them, not to sound too dramatic, we are lost because our food system has changed so dramatically over the last 50 years. And I've been fortunate enough, when COVID struck and restaurants closed, I had over 30 farmers tell me they would have lost their farm without Mike's Organic. And that relationship, that closeness is something that I've carried with me always. So when you come to this place in Costco, you'll meet people who grow real food. And like Mark and Kathleen, I want to help rethink the relationship we have with what we eat. To learn the story of our food, the trail it travels to reach your fork. And when you learn that story, it'll change the way you look at it forever. In 1900, 40% of Americans lived on a farm. Today, less than 1% of us live on a farm. We don't necessarily have to live on a farm to appreciate where our food comes from and the people that grow it. But the more we learn about our food, the better choices we can make for ourselves and for the planet. It's our future, and the future of food lies right here in our hands. So without further ado, I'm excited to introduce two people who have helped shape our food's past and are redefining its future. Mark Bittman, acclaimed journalist, best-selling author, former New York Times columnist. I wish I had this many things after my name. TV and radio star, cook, and all-around legend in the food world. And Kathleen Finlay, a leader in the regenerative food movement, president of the Greenwich Center for Regional Food and Farming, which is a nonprofit dedicated to building a just, healthy, and sustainable food system. Please join me in welcoming Mark and Kathleen.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, everybody. It's nice to see so many people. Gosh, I don't know if I've seen this many people in one place in a while,
Right.
actually. Really great. So I'm just going to ask Mark a couple questions, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. Sound good?
That works for me.
Great. So many of you know Mark's cookbooks. You maybe know this book and some of his pieces in the Times. More recently, Mark has begun broadcasting a podcast that I encourage all of you to take a look at, called Food with Mark Bittman. And he ends he has awesome guests on it, like really great conversations. Some people involved in food, and then some people, because you can talk about food with anyone. So it's fun that you have other people on.
That's the idea.
Yeah, it's really great. But you have an ending question for every guest, and I'm going to start with that question. What did you have for dinner last night?
We had pasta alla matriciani, made by me. Yeah.
Which is?
That was really good.
Everyone know who that is?
Little bit of pancetta, a lot of onion, a lot of tomato, and some pecorino and parsley, chili.
Yeah, it was really good.
It was really good.
Yeah, so let's start a little bit with your story. How'd you get into food? Tell us a little bit about that journey.
I mean, everybody gets into food one way or another, but my childhood was not at all exceptional food-wise. I started cooking pretty much when I graduated college, or almost when I graduated college, largely because there just wasn't, I guess I grew up in New York, and I guess I was exposed to a lot of different and interesting food, and then moved to Massachusetts and then Connecticut, where the food was, shall we say, less interesting. Mostly, I'll say that about Massachusetts, actually, and I'm not just being a homer. But I did start cooking, and I was trying to be a writer, and no one was interested in anything that I was writing about. And then I tried to write about food, and I was living in New Haven at the time. And people were interested in what I wrote about. And then I started by reviewing restaurants, but quickly began writing about cooking. And then I worked for the New Haven paper, the Register, and I freelanced for newspapers all over the country. And then I went to work for Cook's Magazine, which was at the time headquartered in Bridgeport. And blah, 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 blah. One thing led to another. And in 1997, the Times offered me the minimalist column, which I'm sure some of you at least remember. And that ran every Wednesday for 13 years. And during that time, I wrote How to Cook Everything and did a few other things. And I left the minimalist in order to start writing an opinion column for the Times, an opinion column about food, which lasted for 5 years. And I left that in order to write that book. So that's about as fast as I could do.
That's pretty good.
I've had practice.
And so, right, you've been writing about food and food topics and cooking for many, many years, but you deliberately took time and effort to write a pretty serious deep dive into the history and present state of food and what we can do about it. Why now? What made you make that decision?
Well, part of that's personal and part of that's the timing is really personal. I think, as you know, I've been doing a lot of reflection and writing about my career, and I could see in the 90s that our food system was problematic. I could see in the 90s that that farms were disappearing. This wasn't news, but that they were being replaced by industrial farms. I could see that animals were being raised almost exclusively in a way that was harmful to earth, environment, people. I could see those things, but no one was interested. Let's say that I couldn't interest anyone in me talking about it, because by the end of the 90s, Eric Schlosser published Fast Food Nation. And really in the 70s, Francis Moore Lepay published Diet for a Small Planet. So it wasn't as if people hadn't had this conversation, but I wasn't able to convince my editors that I could write about it. So I'm trying not to, I'm trying not to say, oh, I was so far ahead of the curve that no one listened to me. I'm just saying I couldn't make myself heard in a way that I thought I might have been able to. And I think part of it was that I was a cook. I was writing recipes. It was hard, even though I was writing for the Times, and I did write about some serious topics for the Times. I think I was seen as a kind of fun guy who wrote recipes and talked about restaurants and travel and so on. And that was fine, but I think the real problem was that through 2010, or really even later than that, through 2015, you would have a hard time convincing food editors, people running food sections of newspapers or people running food magazines, that you can't separate the fun stuff about food from the serious stuff about food. They would say to me, well, we think food is entertainment. We think food is about cool ingredients and chefs and eating in restaurants and cooking great food and so on. And I would say, I mean, you know this well, most of you know this also, I would say where food comes from really matters. How food is grown really matters. And you can't separate these things. And that was an argument I had with editors starting in the 90s and ending in 2010 when I left the minimalist and started writing the opinion column for the Times. But note that I couldn't write a serious food column for the Times food section. I had to leave the food section and go write for the opinion section, because the food section people at the food section just couldn't see that you could talk about food in more ways than just food is cool, food is fun. And now it's changed.
Has it changed?
It's changed some.
Yeah.
It's changed some. changed a lot because of racial justice. And we could talk about that or not, but important aspects of food are being discussed everywhere now because everybody realizes you can't separate those two things. And again, I'm not taking credit for that, but you asked why this book, why then, and really, I could show you a book proposal that is not that different from Animal Vegetable Junk that I wrote in 88 or 89, and no one was interested in that. So that got published in 2021, not because it took me 30 years to write it or whatever that is. Yeah, 30 years to write it, but because it took me 30 years to sell it.
Right. And people recognize now that that food
And
is
also,
more than.
Part of it is that I got, because of the success I've had, I got to a point where I could say to my editors, I'm writing that book. And not that they had no choice, but I had enough juice to get it done.
Yeah. So let's talk about the book a little bit. You start with a quote from one of my favorite people, Rachel Carson. This is a book about man's war against nature. And because man is part of nature, it is also inevitably a book about man's war against himself.
I mean, how brilliant is that?
Yeah, she's good.
Look,
why that quote and why that quote for this book and why that quote about food?
Food is the most, if we take air for granted, which we kind of have to, which doesn't mean we don't pay attention to it, but it's going to be there. Then we're left with food and water as essentials for human life. And I think we can tie food and water together. There's very few things you can say about one that you can't say about the other. We have done these things, let's say starting 500 years ago. You could argue about whether it's starting 10,000 years ago, starting 500 years ago, or starting 150 years ago. But let's say starting with the beginning of colonialism, we have treated the earth as if it was an ATM machine for resources. We just take and take and take, and we act as if we have infinite money in our bank account. And we have done many things that way. Obviously, mining is the perfect example of an extractive industry. But if you consider soil and nutrients, resources, the same way that iron and tin and copper are resources, and oil, there's a finite amount. And we've done agriculture in a way that just keeps removing nutrients from the soil and really stripping soil from the earth. Same with water. We've used water without much consideration about how much actually exists, and it's finite. So we have, it gets into a discussion of really the growth economy, believing that the only way that our economies can thrive, that our citizens can thrive, is if things just, we keep buying more and producing more and doing more. But in fact, there's a finite limit, and we all know that there's a finite limit, but there's a finite limit to the resources of the earth. And agriculture especially we cannot afford for agriculture to be an extractive industry. And the interesting thing is it doesn't have to be an extractive industry. We know the same thing is true of fossil fuels. We don't need to use fossil fuels in the way that we did for the first 100 or 200 years of the Industrial Revolution, but we don't need to grow food using chemical fertilizer, using harmful pesticides at the expense of thousands of other species, at the expense of our water supply, at the expense of the quality of our air, at the expense of our public health, is in a way the easiest way to put it. So to say that we're at war with ourselves is really an interesting way of putting it. And she wrote that in what, 57 or something?
Yeah,
like
early
that.
50s. Yeah. Yeah. And so talk about a little bit about how we in this country went from, starting with some sense of an agrarian culture that respected and stewarded the land. I mean, there were lots of problems from the very beginning. but it seems like there was a paradigm shift to food as commodity, as a really a capitalistic entity, instead of understanding that food is a fundamental need for all of humanity. In researching this book, did you get a sense of like how that mind shift changed and what it would take to change it back?
I mean, I don't think it did change. I think, if you want to talk about indigenous cultures and you want to talk about Native Americans, we can talk about North America being farmed sustainably. But as soon as the Europeans arrived, things started to go in the opposite direction. And don't forget that as soon as Europeans arrived, they started bringing slaves in too. So land was given primarily to white males and primarily at the behest first of the king and then of the town and the church, and laws were passed that said if you brought people over to the United States, you could buy more land, and land was cheap as long as you were white and male. Now it is true that for the first century or two, you only could farm sustainably. I mean, that's not entirely true either. It was easier to farm sustainably, but sugar farming, cotton farming, these were early monocrops, monocrop meaning one crop at a time on a big plot of land that stripped the soil of nutrients. And sugar is pretty interesting because sugar is so hard on the soil that when you grow sugar cane, you strip the soil of nutrients really quickly. And historically, people have just moved from the eastern part of the world toward the western part of the world and moved sugar production with it. In any case, by the time of the Industrial Revolution, food was, as you said, being treated as a commodity. Wheat especially was grown for export. Grain especially was grown for export. Later corn and soybeans, obviously. And the fundamental problem is that you can grow these crops on huge plots of land, especially once chemical fertilizer was produced, which was about the turn of the 20th century, especially once railroads could move food anywhere, which was in the mid-19th century, but continued into the 20th century, especially once shipping became as sophisticated as it is now. So farmers will grow in the way that makes them the most money, just like almost everyone will do what they do in the way that is most profitable for them. Farmers will grow the crop that's most profitable in the way that's most profitable. And that for the last 100 and 150 years have been what they call cereal crops or grains, and primarily wheat and corn and soybeans. There are a few others that matter, but those are the big three. And you can grow those on huge plots of land with modern machinery, with very little labor, with chemical fertilizers, which are very inexpensive, and with chemical pesticides, which are quite effective if deadly. Pesticides means agent of death, really. All of that is the direction that farming has headed. I heard Mike say, and you and I both know this, that only 1% of Americans are actively engaged in farming now. And that's one of the reasons it's so hard for so many people to get good ingredients, to get local ingredients, to get food that's grown well. And it appears to be so hard for farmers to make it in a way that treats the land well, treats their laborers well, treats eaters well.
Yeah. Yeah. And thank you for, I mean, I think in this country, farming as we know it today, when Europeans arrived, started with food as a commodity, but it's gotten like kind of crazy,
It's
right?
it's gotten worse. I mean, it's very, it's hard. This is dense stuff. This is complicated. It's a complicated and long story. And if it interests you, you might want to consider reading this book, because we're trying to sum up half the book in 30 minutes here or whatever. And it's not easy, but a farm of 300 acres used to be considered a big farm and took more than a family's worth of people to farm it. And now farms of 3,000 acres are considered medium-sized and can be done by a family or just a few people, thanks to, I guess, thanks to is the right way of putting it. Thanks to machinery, thanks to shaping the land so that it can be farmed with machinery, thanks to hybrid seeds, which are designed exactly to produce as much of a given crop on that land as is possible, thanks to chemical fertilizer, thanks to pesticides.
Yeah.
But you have to not care. In order to do that, you have to not care about what food you're producing, how you're producing it, and the impact of the way that you're doing it, the impact the way you're doing it has on the environment and on other species. You have to write that stuff off. You have to, if you're going to produce ultra-processed food, and now 60% of the calories in the United States are from what we used to call junk food, and now is more technically called ultra-processed food. If you're going to produce ultra-processed food, then it's hard for people. It's really true when people say, I can't afford good food, or I can't find the kind of food that you're telling me I ought to be eating. So we have a public health crisis that's a direct result of this style of farming. So you can do this style of farming, but you have to not care about all of that other stuff. And economists call that externalities. What are the external costs of the food that we're growing? Well, the external costs are rising rates of diabetes, harm to our soil, drought and deprivation, lack of water supply, poisoning of the environment, increased rates of cancers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
I'm sure I'm forgetting 5 things, but the externalities are as serious as what's being produced.
Right. So we've created the system that isn't treating those things well, is having the output of that system is food that's not good for us. In fact, you often call it, we're producing poison, basically, in that ultra-processed food. And we need to do something about it. So what are some ideas about how we can steer a food system into something more sane that actually feeds people and puts the prosperity and health of humanity, kind of prioritizes that over, making some gains for a relatively few number of people. And my bias is going to ask you to address regional food in that answer.
Right, let's treat that separately. Let's wait a
Great.
minute on that. When people used to say, what should we do? I do have a laundry list. And it's a good laundry list. It's a really good laundry list. But yesterday someone said to me, and then I started saying, well, what we should do is convince people to take food seriously and to ask yourself the question, what's food for? Is food to nourish people and to have minimal impact on the land and the environment in general and on other species? And to, as I said, nourish as many people as possible, or is food for corporate profit? And most people would answer the first, but we act as if the answer was the second. So that's one sort of big answer to that question. Just ask what food is for and why is food a human right? Because if food is a human right, we've never said that officially. The United States has never said food is a right of everybody. Nutritious food is a right of everybody. They did say that in Brazil in the 90s, and they have said it in other countries even today, but we don't say food is a human right. The UN says food is a human right, but the UN is powerless. So So that's sort of one thing. What is food for? How do we take it more seriously? Those are kind of big questions that I'd encourage people to ask themselves and think about. Then someone yesterday said an even broader thing to me, which is, what do we do? Well, we should be throwing rocks in the pond and watching the ripples spread. And it's, in a way, this kind of vague notion that we just talk about stuff. We just relate to each other about this. Because if you say, what is food for? And if you say, is food a human right? It's kind of hard to not agree with that. And then it's like everybody's issue, where I don't know where things are going to go. It's one of these, I mean, we were living together when I wrote that book. You know that I said, there are times that writing this book makes me feel spiritual, and I'm not, I've never been a spiritual person, but I do think in a way that fixing food is fixing our relationship to the land and our relationship to the earth, and that there's a path there somewhere, but we only know what the first steps of the path are, and then we have to build the path as we're walking down it. And that's, as you know, not the kind of stuff I used to say, but I do believe that. So, however, the laundry list, just for the sake of the laundry list, because I think the laundry list, we can say, here's what food ought to look like in 50 years, but I think it's very important to say, here's what we ought to do about food right now, because people want to know that. So the first thing is you confront your political representatives and you say, where do you stand on some of these food issues that I care about? Because I assume many people are doing that about abortion rights right now, and food is like that in a way, in that we don't bother to talk about it until it's threatened. Now, people are up in arms about Roe v. Wade, correctly, but we took it for granted for 40 years, 50 years, or many of us took it for granted for that length of time. And we take our food supply for granted also, but at some point it's going to be threatened. We saw some of that during COVID. So one thing is to talk to politicians about it. The issues that are easiest to address, they're not the most important issues in food, but the issues that are easiest to address from my perspective are getting antibiotics out of the food supply. Antibiotics are a threat to all of our health. There's a thing called MRSA, which basically means bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics. And when I first started talking about this, which was about 10 years ago, MRSA deaths in the United States were 25,000 a year. And now MRSA deaths in the United States are 50,000 a year. So if they keep doubling, then in 5 years, they're going to be whatever the logarithm is. I can't do it that quickly. But antibiotic resistance comes from using antibiotics routinely in the food supply. And that means feeding antibiotics to animals in their food. So if we get antibiotics out of animal feed, we reduce antibiotic resistance, which means we probably all are more responsive to antibiotics when we do get sick. We also make it more difficult to do factory farming, which I think is something that's in all of our interests too. I'll go through the rest of the list. Is regulating pesticides, regulating factory farms, making it easier for new farmers to get onto farms, making it easier for people who are farming in the way that farming ought to be done for all of us. I don't know what else is on the list. That's as good a start as any. Let's talk about
drill down
regional
on
food.
two. Yeah. Why is regional food important?
The way that the industrial food system works is by, as I said before, not particularly caring what's grown, just making that decision based on profit, and not particularly caring about what effect that agriculture has on our communities and on the environment in general. If we were to concentrate more on local economies in general, local food in particular, then we're aware of what's going on around us. We know where our food comes from. We look for more balanced agriculture. We look for greater biodiversity. we look to support our own farms. We look for a more diversified landscape. We look to produce food that's good for us in our own communities and support the people who do that, while at the same time supporting ourselves by producing and distributing and buying healthier food. You might add some stuff to that, but I'm just going to say that's to look at a food system that actually acts that way. Let's say we had a sort of Northeast cooperative of farms and farmers and distributors and food hubs and farmers markets and CSAs and all of that. That's a huge operation. That's, again, another thing that's 30 years away. But where it starts is trying to support local farming, which I know,
Yeah, but actually that fabric of local entities and food hubs and markets and like what Mike is doing, or farmers that are connecting. I mean, it's there and growing, and anyone can tap into it. And I think for me, what I've seen over the time that I've worked intensely on regional food systems, that the most important aspect is what we've started calling food sovereignty. And it's a notion that, is changing. I think, just as you were pointing out earlier, the difference between why you can't sell an examination or analysis of food in the dining or food section of the country's most notable paper is because we think of food. We have framed food as a luxury, as a foodie thing, as an entertainment thing in those circles. And what I'm seeing now with this type of interweaving of folks that are really supporting their local farms and supporting farmers of color and getting more diverse food and farmers on the landscape is it's about a pride of food in their community. And that isn't like a 7-course meal that costs $600
Right.
that you can brag. It is deeply democratic and sovereign. It's of the people, with the people. And so that's one of the aspects of regional food that I'm most excited about, is kind of in some way really taking back what it means to have regional food. It's something that's not elite. That's something that is more closer to a fundamental right.
Right. I mean, I think the spirit is changing, but it's very, as you know better than I, it's really hard to get land into the hands of people who want to farm it the right way.
Yeah.
And that's fundamental. There's another quote at the beginning of that book about land being the source of all wealth, and it really is. And this country and many others in the world had a history of giving land away to colonialists, and that needs to be somehow remedied.
So talk a little bit about, you've been reporting on some of the developments that the USDA and others are taking to address racism in the food system. That's a Malcolm X quote at the beginning of the book, by the way. But talk a little bit I think this audience would be interested to hear about some of those
the
efforts.
USDA has admitted, first of all, the USDA was sued by Black farmers in the 90s, a number of cases. The most famous one was called Pigford versus USDA. USDA ultimately settled for some number of billions of dollars, but USDA historically underserved descendants of slaves and former slaves and descendants of slaves, especially in the South, and acted in racist ways for 100 or 150 years. and did lose this court case, which acknowledged that. But now the Secretary of the USDA himself, Tom Vilsack, who I'm not the world's biggest fan of, but still it has to be said, says publicly USDA was a racist department and we need to fix that. And they have been for the last 2 years trying to address that. Now they're being fought by Republicans in Congress, and they themselves are not putting as much energy into this as they might. But friends and colleagues of mine who know this situation better than I do say that USDA is really a department undergoing a great deal of change and has been undergoing a great deal of positive change since the Obama administration. And, you know, part of the Trump phenomenon was, of course, to try to dismantle as many good things as possible, because they weren't all that effective. And some of it, there's a lot of USDA, a lot of changes, that positive changes that were made in USDA 10 years ago that didn't get taken away and now are being built on. So I don't want to sound like the world's biggest booster of USDA, but the movement is in the right direction.
Yeah, and lots of other people working on it, lots of frontline organizations that are advocating for underserved farmers to be given land access or given resources or helped. Yeah.
But I think there's two things. There's really, maybe there's more than two things, but there's at least two things that are so big and so hard and so difficult for government to acknowledge because it would directly challenge the status quo. One is that land has been distributed unfairly and that needs to be addressed. That's like going a step beyond talking about reparations for slavery, which is something that was hard to talk about even 10 years ago. But to talk about land reform, which is a step beyond reparations, I think is something that you couldn't talk about two years ago. But now you can say the words in public without being scolded or whatever. So I think that's one thing, is that land was distributed in this country unfairly and inequitably, and that needs to be remedied. And the other is that the way that we do agriculture produces food that's making us sick and harming the environment. And that is just a huge thing. That's about the food supply. It's not about personal choice or behavior change or anything like that. I know you wanted to talk about those things, and we can, but that's just a huge thing. And you can't get USDA to acknowledge that big thing, because then either of those big things, because then you're really addressing how is farming done in the United States and turning that around more quickly than we're doing. Not one small farm at a time, but dismantling industrial agriculture and producing food that's healthy for people and less harmful to the environment and other species. That is just a mind-blowingly big task.
Yeah. Yeah. But I do want to talk about that a little bit, because we often find ourselves in conversations with folks that are pretty adamant that the solution lies with the individual. And I just want to hear your thoughts on that, so that, why is that not the case?
I mean, I had that conversation with Vilsack. He's better than he used to be on it, but there's still this kind of, part of me is a member of the public health community, or I am part of the time I teach at Columbia Public Health School. I'm partly a public health professional in one of my roles. And I think that there were 30, 40, 50 years of misinformation on the part of, or inadequate information on the part of public health representatives in the United States, in that we said it's about choice. You make the right choice, you eat well, and you'll be healthy. And of course, that's true, but it doesn't acknowledge that not everybody's choices are equal, that not everybody's able to make the same choices. So the simplest way I know to put this is to go back to something I said a little while ago, which is that 60% of the calories we produce in the United States now wind up as ultra-processed food, as junk food. And if you think about this, just imagine what a supermarket looks like. And you know that this is true. There are entire aisles of supermarkets, not one or two. There's 6 or 8 entire aisles of most supermarkets where the food is bad for you, where the food, you said this before, where the food more closely meets the dictionary definition of poison, that is, it's bad for you, than it does the dictionary definition of food, that is, it's nourishing. So all of those aisles, that is the food that is being offered to us. And we all know that those calories are cheaper than the calories in the fruit and vegetable department. And we know that that kind of food is more widely available. That's what junk food is. Junk food is ubiquitous. Junk food is what we all struggle to avoid in airports. We all struggle to avoid when we drive down the post road. We all struggle to avoid in supermarkets, but someone has to buy that stuff because 60% of the calories in the United States are that stuff. So that either means that 60% of us buy only that, or all of us buy 60% of that, or some in between space. That food is being produced and that food is being bought and that food is being eaten. And it's, I'm starting to sound like a broken record, but that's the food that's bad for us. That's the food that's bad for the environment. That's the food that's bad for climate change. That's the food that's bad for our fellow species.
Right. The point being, if you make the changes upstream so that the choices that we have on a regular basis are more healthful to begin with, then that's the solution.
Right. I mean, that upstream is right. And it was really during the Bloomberg administration in New York when public health people started to say, we have to make the good choice the easy choice. And that's much more difficult than it sounds.
Yeah.
That's about making food more affordable at farmers markets. That's about making sure there are more farmers markets. That's about making sure that people have access to good, healthy food. Everybody does.
Yeah.
We have to produce it first. We can't just say, okay, everybody has access to good, healthy food. There actually isn't even enough of that to go around.
So before we get to questions, what's going to happen, and I have one more question for you, which is just give us some examples of other places in the world or even here in the US where we are getting food right.
No one's doing it well nationally. The local and regional food movement that we see in the United States that you work on certainly is an encouraging thing and moves things in the right direction. And it's not only happening in the United States, it's happening in Central and South America, it's happening in Europe, it's happening in Africa. But it's small and it's not moving quickly enough and it's not being supported by enough governments. If we want to look at 2 examples of governments that have really done a couple of things right, one was Brazil until 10 years ago, where there was a national movement that guaranteed nutritious food to everybody, that established restaurants that anyone could go to any time of day and buy nutritious organic food that was produced on nearby farms on a sliding scale, where farmers markets had sliding scales, where schools were getting food from local organic farms and those farmers were being supported, where things, that was the best example of things moving in the right direction that the world has ever seen. And it ended when there was some people would call it a coup, and the ruling party in Brazil changed. I'm going to say 2 other things. One is that labeling is a very interesting issue in food, and informing people about what they're eating and what they ought to be eating is an ongoing issue. And Chile has the most progressive labeling laws in the world, to the point where there are foods that can't be marketed. You can't. There's no Tony the Tiger in Chile. Tony the Tiger has been killed. So, so that's an interesting, and it's kind of small, but I was talking about easy changes. That's an interesting and kind of easy legislative change. The most exciting thing that I know of that's happening now is in Andhra Pradesh, which is a state in India. India is this is not a history lesson, but India is a very loose federation, and things vary a great deal from one state to another, kind of like the United States. And in Andhra Pradesh, there's a government-supported program that pays farmers to teach, first to learn, and then to teach other farmers how to farm without chemicals. So it was called Zero Budget Natural Farming, but they changed the name, and now on ZBNF, but now I can't remember what it was changed to. But in any case, the government funded a cadre of people who went to small villages, and many villages in Andhra Pradesh are 1,000 people or less, and the farms are 1/4 of an acre, 1/2 an acre, 2 acres. They're all small farms. People went to a town and they'd say, would you like to learn how to farm without using chemicals, how to farm naturally? And say there'd be 500 farmers in this town. In the first year, 3 would say, okay. But those 3 would have reduced costs and a higher yield. And so the next year, 30 would say, we want to learn how to do this. And then by the 3rd year, everybody was saying, we want to learn how to do this. And then those farmers in that village were trained and paid to go to neighboring villages and do the same thing. This is kind of whatever the opposite of a good Ponzi scheme. And the result is that 500,000 farmers in Andhra Pradesh now farm without chemicals. That's a lot, but there's 60 million people in Andhra Pradesh, and probably 10 million of them are farmers. So there's a way to go. But that, I think, is the most exciting program in farming in the world right now.
Great. Awesome. I think we're going to take some questions from the audience. We have a roving mic somewhere. Right there.
Good evening. Thank you. I think we have to go beyond pesticides and antibiotics, and the future of our planet depends very much on eliminating animals for food, and go to the cell-produced meat if you have to eat meat, or to a plant and vegetarian diet. Otherwise, it will not work. It goes way beyond the things that you have discussed.
Okay, does anyone have a question?
Thank you. Hi. First thing, I work for the Open Space Institute, so shout out to Glenwood. Number 2, you talked about diversifying the landscape, and clearly we need more sustainable farms to produce more healthy food. But at the same time, we need more intact landscapes. We need more wildlife corridors. We need to reforest to mitigate climate change, protect biodiversity. What are some of the farming practices that marry these 2 concepts together and these 2 goals?
You should answer.
Yeah. Nice to see you, friend. So my organization trains new entry farmers. These are typically farmers that are first generation farmers that didn't come from a farming background. They're drawn to farming out of a sense of wanting to participate in a future that stewards the land and provides healthy food. And there's a tremendous synthesis of philosophy around wanting to protect nature and wanting to feed our communities. So The techniques that are getting a lot of attention right now are agroforestry. We're starting a program at Glenwood that's tree ranging instead of free ranging poultry. So working with edible landscapes on several different trophic levels, but being very mindful of the biodiversity levels that we're maintaining around the worked landscape. There's a lot of conversation now happening between just how to blur the lines between managed landscape and conserved wild landscape. You know, that edge, some people call that edge the veld, which is just a really rich source, can be a really rich source of pollination and activity for worked landscapes if they're done in harmony and with consciousness. But I would say that of all the farmers that we train, those kinds of practices, thinking about especially avian habitats and migration, is top of mind.
Can I just
Yeah.
add one thing? There have been studies that show that even if you look at industrial farms, say 3,000 acre farms, there's always an area of that farm that most big farmers in the United States, and we're talking about not the Northeast, but maybe New York State and Pennsylvania, but more like Ohio and Illinois and Iowa, plant every single square foot that they can. I mean, when corn prices go up, people tear up their driveways, literally. But there's always a portion of that land that doesn't produce as well as the rest. And we're even talking, I'm just talking about straight industrial farming. And if you take the 10% of your land that performs worst and you take it out of production, your yield actually goes up. And obviously your biodiversity and your levels of nitrogen in your soil and your water use and stuff all go in the right direction. So there's sort of
strip farming that we saw in Iowa.
Prairie strips.
Yeah.
Now that's not mandated and people do it voluntarily because it makes sense, but that could be mandated. Something like that.
Yeah, it could be mandated, or there could be a program like there is in India where you just spread the good news of what's happening. And great question.
I have a question on the economics of the small regional farms in terms of producing compared to the loss in the huge industrial with tens of thousands of acres, that the cost would be prohibitive to be reaching a large number of people. And another concern I have is, any comment you may have, is that the rest of the world admires America. The rest of the world wants to become like us. And capitalism is part of the process of being efficient and producing. And frankly, not every, even large industrial productions always make it well. A lot of them have also, some of them, I don't know the percentage, have a hard time making it in spite of all the advantages they have. I would like all of us eat good food.
I mean, I think the second thing you're saying about the rest of the world admiring us is an assumption that we can't really, I can't address. But the first one is we can't afford, it's not a pipe dream to say that we need to do local and regional farming in order to feed ourselves. It's a pipe dream to say that we can maintain things the way that they are. The way that climate change is accelerating, and agriculture is industrial agriculture is either the first or second largest producer of greenhouse gases in our country, depending on how you divide things between transportation and agriculture. And this is a crisis. The public health crisis is also a crisis. Diabetes has tripled in the last 20 years. It continues to grow. More people died from diet-related diseases last year than did from COVID. And this year, 50,000 people will die from COVID, or 60,000 people will die from COVID, and 600,000 will again die from diet-related diseases. So I don't know what things look like 50 years from now. I can't say to you this is what they look like, but they will look different. And the only direction that those of us who work on this every day and think of this seriously can see is to reverse the industrialization of farming and to start farming, not necessarily in a small way, but in a more local and regional way. Obviously, we need the same amount of food. Although this is true also, we need less meat. We need to produce less meat. We need to eat less meat. Everybody knows that. Too much.
And most of the food that's grown in this country is going to junk. It's not going to food. It's
Right.
an important point. Keep making. And right here.
Couple issues. I think that I would like to hear, because I know that what are the trends in farming or even in regional farming and in farm ownership being more democratic in this country? Because I think a lot of the things that you're saying sound good, but I think you're fighting an enormous tide that is working against what you're trying to do. And then that goes to the second part of my question, which is where I have heard of small steps, is when communities and particularly schools develop farms or develop small plots of land next to their buildings and incorporate that into the educational system so that students learn everything from science to growing to creating the food that they eat in their own school cafeterias. That's being done in the Philippines. It's being done in other places like that. So I'd like you to comment on that as well.
Mhm. Can I provide an example? So one of the areas of work that's exciting to me right now at Glenwood is we've been paying farmers to produce food for the hunger relief system. So the hunger relief system that gives food to food insecure folks relies typically on donated food from large industrial entities, mostly supermarkets that send packaged food. So there's no fresh food there's almost no fresh food that flows through that system. And so one of the things that we're doing is raising philanthropic dollars to pay the kind of farmers we've been talking about, small, regional, conscientious farmers. In this case, most all BIPOC, LGBTQ, or women farm owners to produce food, and we pay for that production, and then that food goes into the local hunger relief system. So if you just imagine if we could scale that, so you're supporting the kind of farms that we want to see and helping them grow. You pay in advance those contracts, so it's like a wholesale contract for the farm, but allows them to buy the greenhouse or the tractor or whatever they need to grow their operation because they know they're getting those funds. And it's supporting folks that are food insecure with really healthy, dignified food. But that's that is completely different than how we've looked at this complex issue before, where we've incentivized basically large grocery store owners to, actually buy, in some cases, the federal government buy the food that then goes into the hunger relief system. So all that capital is just flowing to, what I would consider the problem, instead of figuring out how that capital from federal resources and state resources could actually help the kind of farmers that we want to see in our region flourish. So that's just one example of how it's starting to work and how it could work.
I mean, I would also say, you're swimming against the tide observation is, of course, apt. And no one's saying this is easy or that these kinds of changes are going to be made in the short run or easily, but that doesn't mean you give up or despair. So that's one thing. The other is the example Kathleen just said, provided is one of hundreds. And I think if we build models to demonstrate how things are done differently, then we will see more and more how things can be done differently. But still, it is a struggle. It's a question of getting government on the right side instead of the wrong side. We have 150 years, I mean, literally 160 years of the United States government supporting and encouraging and spending money on profit-making commodity agriculture. We don't have much history of the United States government supporting agriculture that supports nutrition for most people. And that's a place we have to get to.
Schools are a great example of little lights, points of light that are making change, I think.
I think we have time for one more question, so this will be our last.
Okay, great. I love everything that you guys are doing. It's so wonderful. All the information is so great. I have been doing a lot of reading on these industrial type farms that, you know, have their own little ecosystem with water and fish and all that stuff. And you grow a lot of food and have it located next to towns and cities and that type of thing, which sounded very exciting to me. And then also, I think somewhere in Boston, they're starting to grow meat on grids rather than, so what do you guys think of that direction? Because as much as I think that, you know, having farms and for the ecology and all that stuff is great, there's an awful lot of people to feed.
I think that we should be trying almost every new idea that comes down the pike, but I think that we need to always ask who the idea benefits before we invest too much time or money into it. Closed, but I will say that we know a guy who does some closed farm systems, which is what you're talking about, where animals and plants live together. And that is really a traditional style of agriculture. I mean, to have fish eating plants and fertilizing the plants and have shellfish grow in the same space makes perfect sense. To have sheep in orchards fertilizing the ground while eating the grass between the rows of the trees makes perfect sense, and so on down the line. But what you're talking about is, what do we call this, integrated agriculture? We're talking about
Polysystemic.
a system where you're not growing one crop at a time, but you're providing for lots of biodiversity and raising many symbiotic things that can benefit each other and benefit us at the same time. Makes perfect sense.
And I'll say one other thing is that often when we talk about the kind of agriculture that I'd like to see in the future, that is agriculture that actually feeds people good food, that stewards the land so that it keeps giving back, that builds community and increases food sovereignty, that is not absent of technology. Some people, when they hear that, think that it's kind of a throwback or a romantic vision that doesn't embrace all the innovations that we've made over the last few decades. And I see those technological tools being used every day, and there's lots of room for innovation and new ideas and creativity. So totally agree, and to embrace all the things that we've learned and apply them in a way that still supports those fundamental values, I think. Yeah. Okay, am I closing us out? We're closing. Do you want to say any last words?
I mean, I just think it's so, I mean, you've all raised good points, and it's just a very dense topic, and an hour or 45 minutes, whatever it's been, is a a brief period of time to try to cover all of these things. So I just encourage you to keep thinking, keep talking, keep working on this stuff.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah, thank you.